At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. "Can you fix the warp core of that old ship?" Ibix asked as soon as the human was brought before him by the mansion's staff, getting straight to business without even asking his name. The reason for such abruptness wasn't typical of his behavior, but rather because he had already had the same conversation with 8 other engineers, only for each of them to quit after a few days and force Ibix to repeat the tiresome process of hiring someone new. The human didn't seem offended by the abrupt greeting. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression calm and professional. "Let me see what kind of warp drive we have here," he said, his voice filled with that peculiar accent that Ibix had learned to associate with humans from the outer colonies. The human bent down, and Ibix heard the metallic clank of a large toolbox being set on the floor of the hangar bay. It was an impressive piece of equipment, weathered and covered in scratches that spoke of years of use across countless star systems. The clasps opened, but the human didn't immediately reach for any tools. Instead, he straightened up and took a few steps toward the hull of the old ship. For a long moment, the human simply stood there, staring at his own reflection in the metal. Ibix could see him clearly in the surface, a tall blonde human who looked to be in his late 30s, with strong shoulders and hands that bore the calluses of someone who worked with machinery for a living. The human's expression was difficult to read across species barriers, but there was something in the way he stood, in the angle of his head, in the slow way his hand rose to touch the cool metal, that struck Ibix as profoundly gentle. It was affection. Pure, unmistakable affection. The human's palm pressed flat against the hull, fingers splayed wide as if greeting an old friend. Ibix felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. None of the other 8 engineers had looked at the ship like that. They had looked at it like a problem, like a paycheck, like an impossible challenge. But this human looked at it like it was precious. Ibix, old even by tree rear standards, his pink skin marked by the colorful streaks that came with age and experience, and with his long ears frozen in place, found himself slowly walking toward the human. His footsteps echoed in the vast hangar bay, passing by the skeletal remains of 2 other ships of the same model. Lady Ehzhel had purchased them years ago for spare parts, but she had never found anyone who could actually make use of them. When Ibix reached the human, he hesitated for just a moment before placing a pink hand on the man's broad shoulder. The human didn't startle, didn't even turn his head, just continued looking at the ship with that same intense focus. "I want to believe you'll fix the warp drive," Ibix said quietly, surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. "I have a good feeling about you." Now the human turned, and up close, Ibix could see the blue of his eyes, bright and sharp. The human smiled, just a quirk of his lips, acknowledging the words without responding to them. Ibix gestured around the hangar bay, taking in the 2 striped ships, the organized chaos of spare parts on shelving units that lined the walls, the diagnostic equipment gathering dust in the corners. "You can use everything in this room," he explained, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "Parts from those other ships, any of the tools here, whatever you need. This ship—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This ship is very important to her, to Lady Ehzhel. I would ask you politely to do everything in your power to fix it." The human's smile widened slightly, and he repeated the words back, his tone thoughtful. "It's important to her." "Yes," Ibix confirmed. "I'm sure it is," the human said, but there was something in his voice, something vague and distant, as if he was thinking about something else entirely, something Ibix couldn't begin to guess at. Then the human was moving, returning to his toolbox, kneeling down to begin sorting through his equipment. The conversation was clearly over. Ibix stood there for a moment longer, watching the human work, feeling a vague unease settle over him like a poorly fitted coat. He was missing something important. The human's behavior, his expression when he touched the ship, the way he had repeated those words. It all added up to something Ibix couldn't quite grasp. But the human was working, and that was what mattered. Ibix turned and left the hangar bay, the heavy doors sealing behind him, leaving the human alone with the ships and whatever memories they held. One day later, Ibix found himself being summoned early in the morning to Lady Ehzhel's office, apparently regarding the fixing of her old ship. The sudden forced invitation was strange and an odd occurrence for someone like him, whose position could be considered something higher than a butler, whose job ranged from financial decisions to managing employees, and whose ties to Ehzhel were that of a distant cousin. In all his years of service, he could count on one hand the number of times she had summoned him to her private office for anything other than the quarterly financial reviews. He stood outside the ornate door, his hand raised to knock, and hesitated. Just a moment, just a heartbeat. Something about this felt wrong, but he couldn't articulate what. The feeling from yesterday returned, that sense of missing something crucial, like reading a document where every third word had been redacted. Ibix knocked, heard her voice call for him to enter, and pushed open the door. Lady Ehzhel's office was exactly as it always was, immaculate, organized, filled with the quiet wealth that came from generations of careful investment and social positioning. The furniture was antique, real wood from an old destroyed planet, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with actual physical books, their spines creating a rainbow of colors that spoke to eclectic tastes and intellectual curiosity. But something was different. Ehzhel was sitting in her chair behind the massive desk, but she wasn't working. She was reading a book that was very clearly missing from the shelf directly behind her, creating a gap in the otherwise perfect organization. The book itself looked old, its pages yellowed, the kind of paper that hadn't been touched in decades. Everything felt strange. The book, the summoning, the early hour, the way Ehzhel seemed to be waiting for him rather than occupied with her usual morning routine. Ibix couldn't quite understand why, couldn't quite put his finger on what was wrong, but the vague feeling of unease intensified. Ehzhel lowered her book, and Ibix found himself staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. Her pink skin bore only black streaks, the result of a rare and harmless genetic condition that affected perhaps 1 in every million tree rear. Where most of their species displayed a riot of colors as they aged, Ehzhel's skin was marked in stark monochrome, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. Her face looked surprisingly young for a tree rear of 40 years, especially considering she had refused to undergo genetic rejuvenation therapy, holding to that peculiar belief that one lifetime was more than enough, that there was something honest about aging naturally, about accepting mortality. Her silver eyes fixed on him, and for a long moment she simply stared. Ibix felt himself standing straighter under that gaze, felt the weight of scrutiny that he rarely experienced from his employer. "What is the name of the human who is fixing my ship?" Ehzhel asked, her voice calm but hinting an undercurrent of something Ibix couldn't identify. Urgency? Anticipation? Ibix blinked, caught off guard by the question. I don't know, my lady. I didn't ask his name." "You didn't ask his name," she repeated, her tone flat. "No, my lady. The previous 8 engineers all abandoned the project within days. I saw no reason to bother with pleasantries until I knew whether—" "Why?" Ehzhel interrupted, setting the book down on her desk with a soft thump. "Did you withhold the information that a human was fixing my ship?" The accusation was sharp. Ibix felt his confusion crystallize into something even sharper, almost like offense. "My lady, I wasn't withholding anything. I hired an engineer. I didn't think the species was particularly relevant to report. Should I have been informing you of the species of every contractor we engage?" Ehzhel stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We're going to see him. Right now." "My lady?" Ibix couldn't keep the bewilderment out of his voice. This was utterly unlike her. Lady Ehzhel never involved herself in trivial matters like repairs or hiring contractors. She dealt with high-level financial decisions, social obligations, political maneuvering. It wasn't even normal for a lady of such high class as Ehzhel to know the names of her longtime servants, much less to care about someone they had hired just the previous day. And yet, here she was, standing behind her desk with an intensity in her silver eyes that Ibix had never seen before. "Is there a problem with his work?" Ibix tried. "Has something gone wrong with—" He wasn't prepared when Ehzhel simply walked around the desk, reached out, and grabbed him by the collar of his formal jacket. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and she sighed, a sound of profound exasperation that Ibix had never heard from her before. "I still can't believe you didn't inform me about the human," she said, her voice somewhere between accusatory and disappointed. "We're going to see him right now." And then she was dragging him toward the door. "My lady!" Ibix protested, his feet scrambling to keep up as she pulled him out of her office and into the corridor. "This is highly irregular. What has gotten into you? Lady Ehzhel, please!" But Ehzhel wasn't listening. She dragged him down the hallway with single-minded determination, her grip on his collar never loosening. Ibix caught glimpses of other servants as they passed, saw their eyes widen in shock, saw jaws literally drop open at the sight of the powerful and usually dignified Lady Ehzhel dragging Ibix, their boss, the second most powerful person in the household, across the mansion as if she was a teenager throwing a fit. A junior maid pressed herself against the wall, her tray of breakfast dishes nearly tumbling to the floor as they rushed past. One of the groundskeepers stood frozen in the middle of polishing a banister, his cloth hanging limply from his hand. Ibix caught the eye of Threnix, the head chef, who had stepped out of the kitchen to see what the commotion was about and saw his own confusion and mortification reflected in the older tree-rearer's expression. This was humiliating. This was beyond humiliating. This was going to be the talk of the entire staff for months, possibly years. The great Lady Ehzhel, dragging her cousin and estate manager through the halls like a sack of grain. They burst through a side door and out into the morning air. The ground was still wet with dew, and Ibix nearly slipped on the smooth stones of the path as Ehzhel continued her determined march toward the hangar bay. The massive structure loomed ahead of them, its doors closed but unsealed, ready to open at a moment's notice to allow ships to launch or land. Ibix felt miserable. His collar was digging into his throat, his dignity was in tatters, and he still had absolutely no idea what was going on. Why did Ehzhel care so much about this human? Why was she acting like this? What was so important about— They reached the hangar bay doors, and Ehzhel finally released him, slapping her hand against the access panel. The doors began to slide open, revealing the vast space beyond. Ibix was ready to complain, ready to demand an explanation for this absolutely bizarre behavior, ready to assert some kind of authority in this situation that had spiraled completely out of his control. But the words died in his throat the moment he saw what waited inside the hangar bay. It was impossible. It was absolutely, completely, utterly impossible. And yet, there it was. Not one ship, but 3 ships, all hovering approximately half a meter above the ground. The anti-gravity stabilizers hummed, creating subtle distortions in the air beneath each hull. But that wasn't what made Ibix's mind grind to a halt. It was the space around the ships. Space was bending. It was visible even to the naked eye, a subtle warping of light and distance that created an almost nauseating visual effect if you looked at it too long. The air seemed to ripple and fold around each vessel, reality itself distorting in response to the activated warp drives. It was the unmistakable signature of fully functional, properly calibrated, ready-to-fly warp cores. All 3 of them. The ship the human had been hired to fix, and the other 2 ships that had been stripped for parts, that had been sitting as empty husks for years, that everyone had assumed would never fly again. Ibix felt Ehzhel's grip on his collar loosen and then disappear entirely as she stepped forward, her mouth slightly open, her silver eyes wide in obvious wonder. "He fixed all three of them?" she said to herself, and then, immediately after, as if the answer was obvious, as if she had known all along what would happen, "Of course he did." Ibix turned to look at her and saw something in her expression that added another layer to the growing pile of inexplicable things happening this morning. There was gentleness in her eyes, and nostalgia, and something that might have been joy, or might have been sorrow, or might have been both at once. It was an expression he had never seen on Lady Ehzhel's face before, vulnerable and open in a way that seemed at odds with everything he knew about her. He opened his mouth to ask, to demand an explanation, to say something about this impossible situation, when movement caught his eye. The human was walking down the ramp of the original ship, the one he had been hired to fix. He looked terrible, or at least what Ibix assumed was terrible for humans. His clothes were covered in grease stains, dark smears of oil and lubricant marking his arms and chest. His hair was disheveled, standing up at odd angles. There were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept all night, that he had worked straight through the night. But he was smiling. A huge, genuine smile that transformed his entire face as soon as he saw Ehzhel. "How have you been doing the past few decades?" the human called out, his voice echoing in the vast space of the hangar bay. And then, before Ibix could even begin to process what was happening, before he could compute the fact that these two people clearly knew each other, Ehzhel screamed, "I knew it was you, Leon!" The name hung in the air for a fraction of a second, and then Ehzhel was running, her formal robes billowing out behind her, her carefully maintained dignity abandoned entirely, as she sprinted across the hangar bay floor toward the human. She threw herself into his arms with enough force that the human, Leon, apparently his name was Leon, staggered back a step laughing. She didn't care about his dirty clothes, didn't care about the grease that was now staining her expensive robes, didn't care about anything except wrapping her arms around him and holding on tight. They started talking immediately, words tumbling over each other in rapid succession, too fast for Ibix to follow. Languages mixing, Earth Common and Galactic Standard and what sounded like tree-rear dialect slang from the outer colonies, all blending together in a chaotic stream of conversation that spoke of long history and deep familiarity. Ibix's mind was racing. They knew each other. They obviously knew each other well, very well. How had he not known about this? How had Ehzhel never mentioned knowing a human engineer? And more importantly, why had she kept it a secret? His earlier irritation flared into something sharper. She had dragged him all the way here, made a spectacle of him in front of the entire household staff, just to have this reunion with someone she apparently already knew, leaving him feeling completely left out and utterly foolish. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and slowly began walking toward the pair. They were still talking animatedly, gesturing with their hands, occasionally laughing at shared jokes that Ibix couldn't understand. As he got closer, he started to catch snippets of the conversation. "Can't believe you kept it all these years." "Would never get rid of the Nightrunner, you know that." "Heard about Henry finally settling down on New Terra." And then Ehzhel's voice, suddenly softer, more hesitant. "Did you only come here because you heard news of the passing of my husband?" The question brought their animated conversation to an abrupt halt. The human, Leon, scratched the back of his head, looking suddenly awkward, sheepish in a way that seemed entirely at odds with someone who had just performed the engineering equivalent of a miracle. "Something like that," he admitted. "I'd been drinking a bit after the end of my second marriage. Turns out I'm not great at the whole domestic stability thing. And then I heard about your husband, and He gestured vaguely with one hand, still holding Ehzhel with the other arm. "I decided to move my drinking to the closest establishment to your manor. Figured if I was going to be miserable and nostalgic, might as well be close to an old friend. Didn't expect to find a job posting for a warp drive engineer, though. That was just good luck." That was enough. More than enough. Ibix had been patient. He had been confused. He had been humiliated. And now he was done. "Excuse me!" His voice came out louder than he intended, sharp enough that both Ehzhel and Leon turned to look at him with surprised expressions, as if they had genuinely forgotten he was there. "Would someone please explain to me what is going on here?" They just stared at him, still wrapped in their embrace, and something in their blank expressions made Ibix's irritation spike into genuine anger. "Did you plan this from the start?" He directed the question at Leon, his voice rising with every word. "Were you deliberately trying to get close to Lady Ehzhel by taking this job? Using her grief as an opportunity?" "Ibix," Ehzhel started, but he was on a roll now, couldn't stop if he wanted to. "And you?" He turned to Ehzhel, months of carefully maintained professional decorum crumbling away. "Why aren't you angry? This human clearly manipulated the situation to—" "Ibix!" Ehzhel tried again, but he spoke over her. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's your old lover, and he heard your husband isn't around anymore, and he's taken advantage of the situation, and you're just letting him." The silence that followed was absolute, and then both Ehzhel and Leon burst out laughing. It wasn't polite laughter, wasn't restrained or dignified. It was loud, genuine, stomach-clutching laughter that echoed through the entire hangar bay. Leon bent over, one hand still on Ehzhel's shoulder, wheezing with mirth. Ehzhel had tears forming in the corners of her silver eyes, her whole body shaking. "Oh, stars above," Leon managed between gasps. "He thinks we're a couple." "Nothing romantic ever happened between us," Ehzhel said, still laughing, wiping at her eyes. Then she paused, and a mischievous glint appeared in her expression. "Yet?" That set Leon off again, nearly doubling over. "You're still such a prankster." "I might be serious," Ehzhel said, her voice taking on a theatrical tone. "Just might." "Stop! Stop!" Leon gasped. "I can't breathe. You're killing me." Ibix stood frozen, his anger deflating like a punctured balloon, leaving only confusion in its wake. If you aren't, then what were you?" Ehzhel finally disentangled herself from Leon, though she kept one hand on his arm, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go completely. She turned to face Ibix, and her expression had shifted into something more serious, though the smile never quite left her eyes. "We were part of a pirate crew," she said, simply, as if announcing the weather. "A long time ago, Leon was our tech guy, the one who always kept the ship running, no matter what we threw at it." The words took a long time to sink in. A pirate crew. Lady Ehzhel. The refined, dignified, wealthy, politically connected Lady Ehzhel had been part of a pirate crew. "I don't," Ibix heard himself say, his voice sounding distant even to his own ears. "I don't understand." "It was about 20 years ago," Leon said, leaning back against the ship's landing strut, a dreamy expression on his face. "Best years of my life, honestly. We had this beauty," he patted the hull affectionately, "and a crew of about 15. Ran jobs all across the outer sectors." "I was the captain," Ehzhel added, and there was pride in her voice, clear and unmistakable. "The Nightrunner and her crew. We weren't murderers or anything terrible, mostly just liberation of cargo from people who could afford to lose it. Robin Hood types, smugglers, and tax evaders," Leon agreed, "except in space, and with explosions." "Do you remember that one job?" Ehzhel asked, turning back to Leon with excitement in her voice. "When Henry accidentally triggered the security alert and we had to fight our way out through the loading bay, yes, and Yurix was screaming the whole time about her new coat getting ruined." They were doing it again, slipping into that shared memory space where Ibix couldn't follow. Names of people he'd never heard of, places he'd never been, events he couldn't imagine. And through it all, he kept trying to reconcile the image in front of him with everything he thought he knew about Lady Ehzhel. She had married into wealth, yes, but she had always carried herself with such refinement, such dignified grace. She attended political functions, donated to charitable causes, managed her estate perfectly. She was a pillar of society, someone who appeared in society pages and gave speeches at fundraisers. And apparently, she used to be a pirate captain. A pirate captain! Ibix felt as if the ground beneath his feet had become suddenly unstable, as if reality itself was bending and warping like the space around those activated warp drives. "What happened to the others?" Ehzhel asked, her voice softening. "The rest of the crew?" Leon shrugged, but there was sadness in the gesture. "Scattered. Henry, like I said, settled down. Last I heard, he's got 3 kids and runs a legitimate shipping company, which is hilarious if you knew him back then. Ibix went into politics. Can you believe that? She's actually a regional governor now. Threx died about 10 years ago, heart attack. And Kelvin I lost track of about 5 years back. Think he might still be running jobs, but I'm not sure." "And you?" Ehzhel asked gently. "Me?" Leon laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I went legitimate too, mostly. Got married, tried to settle down, did the whole respectable engineer thing. Fixed warp drives for corporations instead of stealing them. Got married again when the first one didn't work out. That one lasted a bit longer, but..." He trailed off, shrugging. "Guess I'm not built for normal life. Kept getting restless. Kept missing the days when every jump could be our last, you know?" Ehzhel nodded slowly, understanding clear in her expression. "I know exactly what you mean." "Is that why you kept the Nightrunner, even after everything?" "I couldn't let her go," Ehzhel said softly, her hand moving to touch the hull with the same gentle affection Leon had shown the day before. "I told myself it was nostalgia, sentiment, but really, I think I always knew I wanted to fly her again someday." Leon was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened up, his expression becoming more serious, more purposeful. "That's actually why I came. Well, part of why I came. Beyond just wanting to see an old friend and maybe wallow in our shared nostalgia while getting drunk." He took a deep breath, and Ibix saw vulnerability in the human's face, uncertainty mixed with hope. "I don't know if it's a midlife crisis or what," Leon said slowly, "but I've been thinking about the old days a lot lately. About the crew. About how we all scattered and promised to stay in touch but didn't. About how we're not getting any younger, and soon we'll be too old to do anything about it." He met Ehzhel's eyes directly. "I want to gather the old crew, the ones who are still around, who are still willing. I want to see what's out there again, one more time, before we can't anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Ibix waited for Ehzhel to laugh it off, to politely decline, to explain all the reasons why such an idea was impossible. She had responsibilities here, the estate, her social obligations, her position in society, her late husband's legacy to maintain. 1,000 reasons why a wealthy, respectable lady couldn't just run off to play pirate again. Instead, Ehzhel smiled, slow and wide and genuine. "I've been feeling the same way," she admitted. "That's the whole reason I wanted to repair the Nightrunner. I told myself it was just to have her in working order, to preserve a piece of history, but really, I think I wanted an excuse, an escape route." "So, that's a yes?" Leon asked, hope lighting up his features. "That's a yes," Ehzhel confirmed. "Wait," Ibix said, finding his voice at last. "Wait, my lady, you can't be serious. You're gonna just leave? Just abandon everything here and go back to being a criminal?" Ehzhel turned to him, and there was something in her expression that was both apologetic and completely unapologetic at the same time. "Ibix, you've been doing most of the actual management of this estate for years anyway. You don't need me for that." "That's not the point! Well, what about your social obligations, your position? What will people say?" "Let them say whatever they want. Ehzhel said with a shrug that seemed to shed decades of careful social conditioning. I'm 40 years old. I've done the proper society wife thing. I've played my part, and I'm tired of it. I want one more adventure before I'm too old to remember why I loved it in the first place. She walked over to Ibix and placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. You'll be fine, better than fine. You're more than capable of handling everything here. Consider yourself promoted. The estate is yours to manage as you see fit. Pay yourself appropriately. Make decisions. You've earned it. Lady Ehzhel. Just Ehzhel, she interrupted. I think we can drop the formality at this point. Ibix felt panic rising in his chest. This was happening too fast. Everything was moving at light speed and he couldn't keep up. How long will you be gone? Ehzhel and Leon exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them. A while, Ehzhel said finally. A long while. Could be months, could be years. Hard to say. You could die out there, Ibix said bluntly. I could die in my sleep tonight, Ehzhel countered. At least out there, I'll be living first. Leon moved toward the ship's ramp, then paused and turned back, extending his hand toward Ehzhel with a theatrical flourish. Your captain's seat is warm and waiting for you, he said, his voice taking on a formal tone that was clearly an old ritual between them. Will you take command of the Nightrunner once more? Ehzhel's smile could have lit up the entire hangar bay. She took his hand without hesitation. It would be my honor. And then she was walking up the ramp, Leon beside her, the two of them talking animatedly about navigation routes and where to find Henry first and whether Yurix could actually get away from her political duties for a few months. Lady Ehzhel, Ibix called out, desperation making his voice crack. You can't just leave. There are legal documents to sign, financial arrangements to make, staff to inform, the board of directors will need. Above them, the hangar bay ceiling began to slide open, the massive doors revealing the pale morning sky beyond. Stars were still visible in the pre-dawn light, distant and infinite, and calling. Ehzhel paused at the top of the ramp and turned back one last time. You're in charge now, Ibix. Take care of everything. But I trust you, she said simply. You've proven yourself capable 1,000 times over. This is your estate now. Make it yours. And then she disappeared into the ship, Leon following close behind. The ramp began to retract. Through the ship's viewports, Ibix could see movement, could see Ehzhel settling into the pilot's seat, could see Leon strapping himself into the co-pilot's position beside her. The ship's engines, which had been idling at low power, suddenly roared to life. The warp field intensified, space bending more dramatically around the hull, creating rainbow distortions in the air. The Nightrunner rose higher, clearing the ground by several meters, angling toward the open ceiling. Ibix stood frozen on the hangar bay floor, watching as everything he thought he knew about his employer, his cousin, his life, lifted off and prepared to vanish into the stars. Leon's voice came over the ship's external speakers, cheerful and irreverent. Thanks for the job, by the way. Feel free to use those other 2 ships however you want. They fly great. And then the Nightrunner's engines fired at full power, and the ship shot upward through the opening in the ceiling, a streak of light and impossible dreams heading for orbit. In seconds it was gone, leaving only the fading distortion of its warp field and the gradually dissipating sound of its engines. Ibix stood there for a long time, staring up at the empty sky visible through the open ceiling. Around him, the 2 other ships continued to hover, silent witnesses to the impossible morning. Everything he had ever thought he knew about Lady Ehzhel had been wrong. She wasn't just a wealthy aristocrat who had married well. She was a pirate captain who had given up adventure for respectability, only to reclaim it when given the chance. She wasn't the refined, dignified lady he had served for years. Or rather, she was, but that was only one facet of a much more complex person, one who contained multitudes he had never suspected. She had been hiding an entire past, an entire identity right under his nose, and he had never seen it, never even suspected. Slowly, Ibix began to realize the full scope of what had just happened. The estate was his now. The responsibilities, the decisions, the power. Everything he had been managing in her name was now his to control directly. And Lady Ehzhel, just Ehzhel, she had said, was somewhere above him, breaking atmosphere with a human, plotting courses to distant stars, reconnecting with old friends, living a life he couldn't even begin to imagine. And in the hangar bay, 2 perfectly functional ships waited, just in case anyone else decided they had had enough of being reasonable.